Hello, everyone. Good morning to those of you joining us in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. My name is Valbona Zanelli, and I am a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. It is my great pleasure today to moderate this briefing on UK's general elections. I would like to point out that this event is part of the Europe Center's Transatlantic Horizon series, which charts an ambitious agenda for the United States and Europe for 2025 and beyond. This event is also part of the Transatlantic Security Initiative's 2024 on the NATO-Washington Summit campaign. As we all know, on July 4th, UK voters headed to the polls to elect a new parliament. And the results of these elections showed a landslide victory for the Labour Party, which ended 14 years of consecutive Conservative Party rule. However, as many analysts have shown and have pointed out during the last few days, voters, it seems that were less enthusiastic about a Labour victory after 14 years and more enthusiastic about putting an end to more than a decade unpopular Conservative policies. As we saw in last Thursdays, we also witnessed Nigel Farage's far-right populist party perform well in over 100 constituencies, although, and making it the third largest party by vote, although having only 5 seats. And so some of these questions that we will discuss in the next hour with our fantastic speakers in this panel will look at what are the main priorities for the next UK government. We'll try to explain a little bit the vote. What does that really mean? And also, what role will the UK play in the future in the global stage, and also when it comes to transatlantic relations? And so here to unpack these questions and even more, I'm joined by a great group of experts and friends of the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council. So joining us today is Jan Bond, the Deputy Director of the Center for European Reform, our very own Charles Lichfield, who is the Deputy Director and C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center, Ed Owen, which is the founder of the Power Test podcast and senior communications and strategy advisors to Labour cabinet members, as well as former special advisor to the Home Secretary under the Tony Blair government. And last but not least, Jasmine Serhan. She's a staff writer at Time magazine, and Jasmine also has published in the last few days a couple of articles. So thank you very much for joining us today. Before we begin with real work, I'd like to point out to a few housekeeping items. It's very important that we would like to hear the questions from the audience. So I'd like to point out from the very beginning that we're going to collect those questions. You can submit those at askac.org, and make sure to follow us on Twitter at AC Europe and use the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. And actually, that's the hashtag also coming to the looking at the starting the NATO summit tomorrow. So I'd like to start with the first round of questions, and I'd like to start with Jan. What we saw last week, a large majority of the Labour Party in the UK House of Commons, more than 60%, with 411 seats. So big celebration for the UK Labour Party. The Conservatives lost about 250 seats, going down to only less than 25% compared to more than 40% in 2019. But also, as I pointed out, Farage, coming, the third largest party, placed the second party in more than 100 constituencies. So Jan, what are the big takeaways from your perspective when you look at the outcomes of the elections?
Well, thanks, Val. So I think what you've said is exactly right, that Labour's vote only went up by less than 2%. And yet the number of seats that they hold has gone up dramatically. And that is very largely because of the success of reform. Reform drove the Conservative Party into second and in some places third place in many parts of the country. So it's a very strange election. The Liberal Democrats are congratulating themselves on achieving a record number of seats, 72 seats, more than they've had in a century or so. and yet their vote is, basically not much more than it was 5 years ago, about 12%. They received 3.5 million votes, fewer by some 600,000 than Nigel Farage's Reform Party received, and yet they get 72 seats and Reform gets 5. So it is a very strange election in that way.
Well, strange in the sense that there needs some reform also when it comes to, the electoral, codes, or strange in what sense?
Well, I mean, the electoral system has always produced results where there has been a gap between the proportion of people voting for a particular party and the number of seats that it gets. But the number of, as it were, wasted votes this time, I think, has been greater than ever. Now, I'm a supporter of electoral reform. I would like to see a more proportional system. But I think it's going to be pretty hard to persuade a Labour Party that has just benefited so much from the existing system to vote in favour of changing to something which would undoubtedly would have given them a significantly smaller number of seats and therefore less power to do what they want to do in the coming 5 years. So yeah, I mean, I think long term that's going to become more and more of a problem. If you want people to feel engaged in the political system, then putting them in a position where quite often their vote is going to be wasted seems in the long term, a dangerous thing to do.
Absolutely. Very good point, Jan, because actually it looks like that's also a narrative that drives some of the populist parties in throughout Europe, not only in the UK. I'd like to ask Jasmine now regarding, we saw that the turnout also was around 60%, and actually no election in the UK has had this low turnout in the last 20 years. So how do you explain the lower voters turnout, but also what do you think are the main key issues that drove those people that went to vote?
You're absolutely right. This was a low turnout election, as you say, 60% compared to previous elections, certainly lower. And in fact, according to the More in Common polling firm, I learned today that in 60 constituencies, turnout was actually under 50%. So in terms of why turnout was lower, I mean, I have a few theories. The first being that despite the fact that this was such a seismic election, which of course with of course a very exciting result, this was actually quite a dull campaign. The sort of comical start of it notwithstanding, Rishi Sunak standing in the rain, announcing this election. There wasn't a depth of really policy discussion. Starmer and Sunak as personalities are very seen as very technocratic, managerial. This wasn't. I wasn't here for the '97 election, but it certainly, from everything I've heard about it and read about it, it certainly didn't feel like there was the star power around Starmer that perhaps Tony Blair had. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think also a big reason perhaps that we didn't see many Britons go to the polls is that, even throughout the campaign, we saw that Labour's victory very much felt like a foregone conclusion, so much so that the Conservatives, by certainly the middle and end of it, were warning voters against handing Labour a supermajority, a term that, as I've repeated many times, and I know others have too, has no real meaning or significance in this US context, or sorry, pardon me, in the British context. It's borrowed from the US context. Having the supermajority, as it were, doesn't afford Labour any additional powers. Of course, having a bigger majority is always helpful when it comes to passing legislation, but a majority of one is also helpful in that respect. But the fact that the Conservatives were focusing so much of their sort of campaign messaging around that was, I think, a tacit sort of admission that they were going to lose this election. And I think for a lot of voters kind of felt, well, if it's a foregone conclusion, if we know what's going to happen, then perhaps there's no reason to turn out at all. But as for the reason that, or I guess the issues that brought people to the polls, those who decided to go. I mean, as you mentioned aptly in your introduction, this was a change election. Many people indeed wanted to punish the Conservatives, particularly after the years of financial and political instability that we've had, 3 prime ministers in 1 year. I don't need to remind everyone what that period was like. But I think the biggest reasons that we've seen from subsequent polling after the contest that people came to the polls, first and foremost, the NHS and health policy, I think was a big issue that people really cared about, followed by policies on the economy, as well as a general belief that Labour would be more trusted to represent people's interests. And, however broad and indeed shallow support for Labour might be, it did very much seem like there was this sense of, you know what, the Conservatives have had 14 years of this, let's give them a shot, let's give them a chance to prove themselves. And indeed, that's the challenge that they're going to have starting, well, now.
Well, as you point out, Jasmine, rightly, that in the political campaign, even the slogan for the Labour Party was change. So we have to see, what change will mean in the future in terms of the key policies of the government. And we have to remind the audience that, people in the UK have gone through a lot of reforms, even in the last 10 years. So there has been this sense of changing and reforming for a very long time. So really, maybe this is now a chance for the Labour Party to show what that will really mean. And so at this point, I would like to ask Ed regarding, the big takeaways for you, Ed, but also, as it was pointed out by our 2 speakers, this is more of a historic loss for the Conservatives. As Jasmine pointed out, 14 years, 5 prime minister, 1 Brexit too. So what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Ian and Yasmin, but perhaps have a slightly different take. I think the UK electoral system has always been a peculiar system. In the end, it is 650 mini elections, and I think this election really showed that. So you had quite a lot of discrepancy by constituency. So, for instance, Labour, if you look at the national picture, Labour did very poorly in the seats it already held and did very well in the seats it needed to win. So firstly, it was very efficient at getting its vote out where it needed it. It also lost some seats to independents who particularly campaigned on the Gaza issue. So in the sense, again, very localized, very specific, very constituency-based outcomes of the election. So in a sense, people were voting the system that they have. So I don't think it's fair to say that it's therefore, voters aren't just robots. They do understand the nature of the British electoral system, and they used it. And as Ian reflected, an extraordinary quirk in a way, which the Liberal Democrats, the traditional third party in the UK, which has long campaigned for electoral reform because it's long been harmed by the British system, actually was very effective this time of targeting particular seats and effectively won the same proportion of seats it would have done in a proportional system. So it's a really interesting reflection, and so I think it certainly reflected change. It certainly reflected. I agree with Yasmin that in the sense, I think for 2 years now, Labour has been 15-20% ahead in the polls, and in the sense that had been baked in, I think, pretty clearly. People assumed, as Yasmin reflected, you even had the Conservative Party accepting in the last week of the campaign that Labour was going to win. It was warning people that you shouldn't win in too big a way. So I think to some extent the suppression of the Labour vote was partly about the efficiency of the campaigning and partly because there was a baked-in element of Labour winning. But of course, the general point that Labour is being elected on this big majority with a relatively low proportion of the vote, and it is the lowest proportion of a vote that a governing party has received, I think, for 100 years in the UK. So it certainly does have some issues, and Labour will need to be, and Labour will, in a sense, has this big majority. It can do things, and I think it will need to be bold because it campaigned in a very cautious way, but it'll need to govern in a bold way, not least to take on a lot of that disillusionment and disenchantment and disaffection that's been talked about, both in terms of low turnout, both in terms of the support for reform. Labour's now going to need to deliver. We've had effectively, certainly since the Brexit referendum in the UK, we've had governments that have effectively delivered very little. and they've delivered very little because of extraordinary internal conflicts within the Tory party, all sorts of issues, which effectively has further disillusioned voters about what actually politics can achieve. And it's really incumbent now on a Labour government to start, in a sense, for its own future, to start delivering and demonstrating that politics does matter and that you can actually have government that can actually improve people's lives. That's the real challenge now for Labour.
Well, absolutely, Ed. And I think that's the biggest challenge in going forward, disillusionment of, people throughout Europe, throughout the world, if we want to put that. And here I would like to ask Charles. We were discussing, Charles, that Nigel Farage, his party was the third largest party, placed second in more than 100 constituencies. So how do you explain that? And how important is the Labour victory in the UK against the backdrop of rise of even far-right populism in Europe? We had that fear in France. We're seeing that in other countries. So how would you explain that, Charles?
Thank you. So unlike Ed, I don't have any formal association with the Labour Party, and yet I pretty much agree with him that the UK electoral system is quite well understood by its voters, and voters like to complain about it, but they do understand it, and so they operated within that system. And Labour's quote unquote low share of the vote doesn't really mean much doesn't really harm this new government's mandate, at least in my opinion. What happened to Reform, and with their result, is also, I think, a function of how well British voters understand the first past the post system. They knew the Conservative Party wasn't going to do well, so this was an opportunity to express a frustration for former voters of the Conservative Party and also former Labour voters who haven't gone back to Labour, at least yet. This was the protest option in less wealthy parts of the country. The so-called red wall that voted for Brexit, to many people's surprise in 2016, but now it's sort of baked into everyone's calculations. How do we appeal to the former red wall voters in the north and northeast? I think a lot of the voters who have been disappointed by Brexit but still haven't decided that it was a bad idea. Reform was quite good at appealing to those voters, and so in 100 constituencies, you now have Reform quite close behind Labour. Does this mean that it will change how Labour governs? I don't think so. The leader of that party, newly appointed leader, he came back very recently, Nigel Farage, said that they're sort of gunning for overtaking Labour in the next election. That's 5 years from now. And so I think it's quite unlikely that it changes any of the policies that the Labour government will now put in place. And they will simply hope that the country will be in quite a different state 5 years from now, both in terms of prosperity, also in terms of some of the issues that Reform likes to campaign on, like illegal migration and boats crossing the channel. It's just so long away, especially in terms of British politics, where everything has moved quite quickly over the past few years, and we've had several prime ministers in the parliament that's just left us. That I don't think it will really be a factor, at least immediately. It's important to monitor, and the UK media system, especially as it now functions with a right-wing TV news channel, which didn't exist before, several radio stations that also pandered to that audience. These are not things that should be ignored, and I think this new Labour government is politically astute enough to monitor them. But if the question is whether it will change policy, my answer is probably not. You also asked about the rise of the far right more generally. I sense that the question about France has been changed a little in the past few hours. The question may initially have been about far right victory or something like that, but as we've all seen, and to everyone's surprise, including my own, I must admit, I didn't think the far right would win a majority, but nor did I think they would come third in the French parliamentary election. And full disclosure, I'm speaking to you right now from France, and not the UK. So what may have been a sort of unusual a trend, the UK bucking the trend in 2024. That's something that commentators might have been looking forward to pointing at, saying the UK was behaving in a different way to other countries. I don't think we can really say that anymore. And it's not just about France. The European Parliament elections, the sort of simplistic headline was that Europe moved to the right. But in most systems, most of the EU member states, the centre held. This isn't a very important election, however. The UK is coming out of 14 years of conservative rule, and seen from Europe, there is quite a lot of optimism about what can be achieved with this Labour government. Doesn't want to rejoin the EU or any of the main pillars of the EU, but there's quite a lot of optimism on what can be achieved.
Well, thanks, Charles. And we'll try to explore in the next few minutes also some of that optimism that exists actually in Europe. So I would like to go for a quick round of one question to each of you, which is, what do you think should be the main priorities of the new government, and what can the government do in the short term to show that they are serious about this change, these reforms? We know that the key issues for the UK voters go from the cost of living, health issues that Jasmine mentioned, immigration, which is another big issue, climate, budget, and Brexit or not Brexit. We can discuss about that. So maybe I'd like to start with Ed here. So Ed, what needs to be done and what can the government do in the short term?
So the overwhelming issue, and it's been, there's the new shadow, not shadow, sorry, it's one of those things you've got to get out of your system when a new government takes over. The new Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, who's the Finance Minister, Rachel Reeves, who's very much been the architect of Labour's economic policy, is making a speech in London, I think it's in London today, in which she's setting out that the overwhelming mission of the new government will be growth, economic growth. And really, it all comes back to economic growth. The ability, we all know the UK's economic situation and very, very tight fiscal environments it's operating in. For the Labour government to do very much, whether improving public services, all sorts of things it wants to do, it's going to require an increase in economic growth. And that has got to be and will be the absolutely overriding mission of the government. As many will know, the Labour opposition and now Labour government has talked about 5 missions. So it's looking to sort of bake into the government administrative system how you can generate capacity across the government system in the UK to focus on 5 key missions, and they are primarily, one of those is economic growth, and the others are on energy and health and education and others. But it will all come back to economic growth. So the question is, can the UK under a Labour government start, in your question about sort of quick wins, short-term wins, can they start to unlock the economic potential of the UK? I think there will be some, they are certainly hoping that the political stability which Labour's majority brings to the UK will unlock a lot of investment in the UK. And I think there's some evidence to say that that will happen. I think the key issue, and Rachel Reeves herself has made this point, and it's quite an interesting, it's going to be very interesting politics. It's not very sexy as an issue, but it's about planning reform, permitting reform in the sort of US parlance. This is about, so UK has quite restrictive planning arrangements, which has been restrictive of a lot of house building, a lot of infrastructure development in the UK. The Labour government has promised to reform and take on, if you like, the political resistance that's often been the case in Britain, which has stopped reform of the planning system. That will be an interesting test, not least because, of course, the nature of the election result has meant that a lot of Labour MPs are being elected in seats in middle class, affluent areas on the green belt, as we call it in the UK, areas of that will be resistant to too much house building and too much infrastructure development. So that's going to be the interesting, I think, political issue, which comes back to that point about how you can drive economic growth. If Labour isn't successful, that will be in 4 or 5 years' time the big issue, which will which will be its undoing going to the next election. So that is where all the focus is. There are lots of issues too, but it all comes back to that.
Well, thank you, Ed. Here, I'd like to follow up with Charles because economic growth will be the main issue at the table. However, the Labour government is set to inherit the same economic landscape and fiscal environment that the Conservatives have established. And so they also have made it explicit that they're going to be committed to restrain and bind the economy to strict fiscal rules. And that has been one of the main issues, that voters were not happy with Conservatives, and also keep low debt levels. So now, considering that we have a rising cost of living, high debt, low productivity, what can the Labour government actually do when it comes to boosting UK's economic growth?
Thank you. Excellent questions. To some extent, they've kept their cards quite close to their chests. You're absolutely right that they didn't want to fall into the trap in the campaign, since we should mention the campaign before we look into the future. They didn't want to fall into the trap of being caught out making any promises that could be described as uncosted or not financed other than through additional deficit spending. To some extent, it became a bit of a weight on the dynamism of the campaign, but they won. So they will think, the campaign strategists will think that their strategy has been vindicated. But it is true that some of their key promises, which is unusual, I guess, for a Labour government, at least in the way people think about these things in terms of cliches, it's unusual for a Labour government coming in promising no tax increases, at least on the main taxes. There may be a few, maybe a sort of very small wealth tax, maybe an increase on capital gains tax, inheritance tax, but in the main taxes that most people pay, income tax, VAT, no increase, which doesn't leave that much leeway. They claim that, as Ed has said, the stability of 5 years ahead with a strong majority will also unlock some investment. I think that's true to an extent, but not to the extent that the fiscal receipts will increase very soon and then they'll be able to increase spending. So the promises they've made immediately in terms of making people feel better about their lives are quite small. A few more hires in the National Health Service, education, but not really that much. So what else is available? Market access, I think, is important. Not just talking about the EU. There's also the US, given that this is an Atlantic Council event. I thought I'd also mention the US-UK trading relationship. But first of all, on the EU, similar campaign strategy of being very, very cautious which promises they made, because they didn't want to give any device to their main opposition, the Conservatives, saying that they were going to reverse Brexit. That being said, in the final stretches of the campaign, they felt confident enough to say a few things about how they would approach their relationship with the EU. And already there's a Minister of State, so the second level below in cabinet, below Secretaries of State, who will be devoted full time to the Constitution and relations with Europe. It's a Welsh MP. What this means, I think, is not re-entering the customs union or the single market, but quote unquote sectoral deals, which are somewhat promising. I think the deal that the US and the EU have currently, the UK and the EU have currently, is very suboptimal and came from very specific conditions, slightly rushed during a year when we were all still in lockdown. So there is quite a lot that can be done on exchange of services, of workers to some extent in very specific circumstances. For instance, music performers. I mean, maybe not a huge boost to GDP, but something that is a quick deliverable, quick win. And then on customs, the Conservative administration, the outgoing Conservative administration, has dragged its feet on the application of a lot of rules of products coming into the UK. So this is more of a difficulty that the Labour administration inherits. Not something that will necessarily bring growth, but rather a bit of a headache that they need to work out on customs checks, especially for agri-foods. But I think the sectoral deals are somewhat promising. With the US, the Conservative government did manage to get some rather promising language into the Atlantic Declaration of 2023. Everyone was focusing on the defense elements. But like the EU, the UK is chasing or trying to run after a critical minerals deal with the US. not only for access to US critical minerals, but also because it provides, depending on interpretation of the deal, provides access to US subsidies for UK-produced electric vehicles. So that's something that the Labour government can push for and might perhaps be able to deliver on before the EU is. Japan already has one, and so it's possible the UK gets one. Certainly not before this US election, but afterwards anything's possible. I think we'll probably come back to comparing Trump and Biden and their relationship with the UK. But one thing I'll say, given we talk about market access, is that this Biden administration has not really offered market access to anyone, including very close friends. There might be a slight change of strategy in a second Biden administration. Everyone's concerned about the Trump administration if it comes back, given that there might be blanket tariffs imposed on any foreign good. But what the people inside the campaign have started telling think tankers like me is that deals will be available. So there's the blanket tariff, especially if you're being too nice to China, but then we can offer you a good deal. So the UK might go after that.
Well, thanks, Charles. You talk about market access, relations with the US that are very important. I recall that a couple of years back before Brexit, one of the ideas of former President Obama was to push UK to stay in the European Union in order not to lose the benefits of TTIP that at that time was in negotiation, which did not work out. So no, we haven't seen, such important.
It didn't just fail because of the UK's departure, and many things going against TTIP.
So I'd like now to ask Jan and follow up on this question of UK's relations with the European Union, not only talking about potential sectoral deals with the European Union, but also it's not very clear what is actually, the goal of Labour Party in order to resetting the relations with Europe. There were some very interesting data that I read while preparing for this conversation. That's a study of Britain's National Institute of Economic and Social Research that estimated that UK's real GDP, which is 2 to 3%. It's lower today compared to the scenario if Britain had remained in the European Union. And so even, in terms of the GDP growth rate, it's only 1.7% higher than the pre-pandemic. And if we look at the Eurozone countries, it's around 3.7%. So it's double the growth rate. So how should the new government go about rebuilding relations with the European Union? And here I have more, in mind specifically economic relations too.
Yeah. So I think the problem is that they've painted themselves into a corner already because they have ruled out rejoining the single market, rejoining the customs union, reinstituting the free movement of labor. I'm more pessimistic than Charles about what can be achieved. I don't think the EU is very interested in sectoral deals. From the EU's point of view, the trade and cooperation agreement that it did with the UK works rather well. It gives free movement of goods, which is where the EU had a trade surplus with the UK. It gives very little in the area of services, which is where the UK was most competitive. Why would you want to alter that if you're the EU? So I think Keir Starmer has put himself in a position where actually it's quite difficult to know what he can do that is going to be decisively different. There are some small things that he might be able to negotiate, and I say might. So Labour has talked about negotiating something on sanitary and phytosanitary checks, which would essentially mean that the UK would accept all sorts of EU regulations on food safety, animal and plant hygiene, and so on. And in return, the EU would not make as many checks on UK goods going into the single market. And that will help to a certain extent. But it's pretty marginal because that's actually a fairly small part of our economy. The big parts of our economy in the services sector are the ones where I think it's going to be the most difficult. There's been talk about negotiating an agreement on the mutual recognition of qualifications. Well, that's an area where the EU and Canada have spent many years negotiating and ultimately have only relaxed the rules for a very small number of professions. So I think there are a lot of obstacles in the way of what Labour wants to do. And I agree very much with Ed. They want economic growth. They need economic growth to be able to do all of the other things that they have on their agenda. You know, how do you invest more in the NHS? Well, if your economy stays at the same size, then you've got to tax people more or you've got to cut services elsewhere. That's very unpalatable. So you try to grow the pie, but what are your options for growing the pie? You have to find somewhere to sell to, or you have to find some internal market that you haven't yet tapped, and that's not straightforward to do. Pretty much anything that Labour wants to do, it has to find money from somewhere to do it. You know, fixing the social care system, which actually is one of the things that makes the NHS not work. It's particularly elderly people who could be discharged from hospitals, but don't have people to care for them when they go back into the community. So you need a system that works for people like that. Housing. Ed mentioned the speech that Rachel Reeves made today, and housing is a big part of that. You know, we don't have enough housing. That makes it difficult for people to move. It means a large part of people's a large part of people's income is spent on their housing, so they don't have discretionary income that they can use for other things that will then, you know, help the economy to grow. So everywhere, Labour is going to be looking for things that can generate some growth, but they have taken the most obvious thing, which is doing more trade with the EU, and they've ruled out a number of the ways in which it could be made easier.
I agree, and actually, Keir Starmer, he actually had promised to reopen the post-Brexit trade cooperation agreement in an effort to get a better trade deal with the EU. But as you point out, the EU might not be interested to do that. So how do you explain this limited level of ambition also when it comes to the EU? Also, because, you know, based on polls, it looks like 60% of voters in the UK think that Brexit has been more of a failure than a success. So how do you explain the low level of ambition?
So I think it's worth going back to the first question that you asked about the election and looking at the success of reform. If you take reform off the map, then Labour probably wins a majority, but a very, very small one. If you increase reform's vote by another 10%, then Labour probably doesn't achieve a majority at all, and there are a lot of seats where reform takes the seat. I think Keir Starmer is terrified that in 5 years' time, reform will be the party breathing down his neck, saying, you know, Keir Starmer has betrayed the true faith of Brexit, and, you know, because of him, more Polish plumbers are returning to the UK, and this is terrible, and what are we going to do about it? You know, there is scope there for a very toxic debate to resume. And I look at parts of the country that, in fact, have suffered from Brexit. Places like the northeast of England, which were heavily dependent on trade with the EU, goods trade with the EU, and also heavily dependent on the EU for regional development funds. And it's places like that where actually reform polled particularly strongly. So the argument that the reason that we haven't seen the benefits of Brexit is not that Brexit was a terrible idea, but that it wasn't done hard enough, still seems to resonate even in parts of the country that have suffered the most from the hardness of the Brexit that has already taken place.
Well, thank you, Jan. And maybe
Can I just add one
Yes,
comment?
please.
Thank you. So I don't disagree with anything Ian said, but I think those circumstances also dictate in part why the headline-grabbing customs union and single market goals cannot be broadcast and aren't even realistic within the next 5 years. An overwhelming majority of the Labour MPs who've just been elected aren't great supporters of Brexit. They couldn't really say it during that campaign, but I think would naturally want there to be a closer relationship with the EU on trade. You can't market it that way because of, well, in the election it was about beating the Conservatives, and now because of the reform, the position reform has taken. So that's why they have to fall back on these deals. I guess I'm slightly more optimistic, not because there's an immediate economic gain for the EU to have. It would be marginal for the EU, perhaps slightly bigger for the UK. But because in a broader context, the EU also views this deal as, so what the deal from 2019 from 2020 as suboptimal, because there is another dimension of security and defense where the EU is very keen to improve its relationship with the UK. And so I think it is capable of thinking slightly more holistically. There may be the argument that doing a deal that favors the UK when the UK has left is a sort of moral hazard. The arguments that we all knew off by heart from 2016 until 2020, those are still true, but I think there is just a slightly more flexibility now, given that it's very unlikely we'll see any country leave the EU at this point. So that's where my marginally more optimistic take than Ian comes from on these sectoral deals. It's also because the customs union and single market negotiation just isn't really available or feasible for the following few years. The EU also knows that. So you have to concentrate on what's possible, and there are lots of gaps there.
Yeah, I agree, Charles. More flexibility from the EU side, but also necessity for more unity in the European continent, considering the current security environment in Europe. So that might be, an opening, I think, for improving economic relations between the EU and the UK. I would like to move to the question regarding foreign and security policy. It looks like we're going to expect more or less a continuity when it comes to foreign policy of the new government, compared also to the last conservative government. So I'd like to ask Yasmin. So my question for you is regarding Labour's position on the war on Gaza. In Gaza. So while foreign policy issues rarely actually, decide elections in many countries, Israel-Palestine emerged as a key issue for a number of traditionally safe Labour seats. And that's what you write actually in your last article, I quoted you. So how has the Labour's policy on the conflict evolved in your view? And how will the new Labour government handle the issue moving forward?
Yes, so I think you're absolutely right that on the whole, foreign policy-wise, there hasn't been a lot of daylight, and certainly on topics like Ukraine, between the Conservatives and Labour. On Gaza, I actually think we have started to see, even before the election, a shift and a distancing. But unfortunately for Labour and for Keir Starmer in particular, that daylight with the Conservatives wasn't seen at the very beginning. And indeed, it was comments that I believe Starmer made shortly after October 7th, when on a program, I believe speaking to LBC, when he was asked about Israel's decision to cut off power and water to the Strip, he said, he defended it. He said that Israel had the right to do that. And of course, subsequently, we've seen that was a decision that was taken that was widely seen as collective punishment. And to be coming from, a human rights lawyer, I think rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So to your point, Labour did, despite the historic landslide, did actually lose some seats in this contest. I believe 7 total, 4 of which, or actually 5 if we count Jeremy Corbyn, to independent candidates. And the one thing that unites all these independent candidates is that Gaza was really kind of central to their messaging to voters. Now, I think in terms of Labour's positioning, as I say, there wasn't a lot of daylight between them and the Conservatives. since in the kind of interim months, and certainly this year, Labour has come out in favor of a ceasefire. Labour was putting more pressure on the Conservative government to release the legal advice with regard to the whole discussion about whether Israel was violating international law in Gaza and how that would impact the UK continuing to supply aid or security assistance to Israel. So, they did take some steps to be more critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza, but it didn't prove to be enough in some of these contests. And indeed, what we saw was that in what we would call traditionally safe Labour seats, not only did they lose some seats, but some of their now cabinet ministers won their seats by just hundreds of votes. And this includes the health minister, Wes Streeting, but also, very key big Labour figures like Jess Phillips. And in terms of, why, I think obviously people have looked to the fact that these seats in particular, what sort of makes them stand out is they did have large British Muslim populations. We do know that the issue of Gaza has struck a chord with that population in particular. But I think it is also safe to say, actually, that this is an issue that goes beyond just one demographic. I think a lot of young people haven't exactly been happy with Labour's position on this. And indeed, the majority of British people support a ceasefire in Gaza. So, but in terms of how, this losing those seats will affect Labour and Labour's policies, losing those seats obviously was, I think, concerning for Labour, considering that it even lost some of its shadow cabinet ministers who were tipped for inclusion in government. That said, as we've already established, Labour has a very large majority, and it was already actually even showed that it is going to pivot even further. I think I was seeing a headline in The Guardian just from today that Labour is expected to drop its challenge to the ICC over the arrest warrant requests for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister. So, we may well see Britain try to take a bit more of a harder line with regard to the war, continuing to call for a ceasefire. But yeah, it's certainly the case. I think Gaza did feature in the way that I think foreign policy issues, as you established, don't typically do so. Whether it's going to change a lot of things, I think the reality is that these 4 or 5 MPs who are going to be, or 5 MPs, I should say, that are going to be sitting as independents are not probably going to have a massive impact on foreign policy just by sheer numbers. I don't think they're going to be able to have the sway that perhaps voters think they do, but it is a way for voters to signal that they are unhappy with kind of the direction or the positioning of the Labour Party in the past and to show what they expect from them in the future.
Well, thank you, Jasmine. One of the questions that was briefly discussed, one of the issues that was briefly discussed also was support for Ukraine. And we see that there we have a bipartisan agreement, so that will continue also with the new government, since the UK is a significant provider of aid to Ukraine, military aid, training, and economic support. And specifically regarding also security issues, I'd like to ask Jan about the proposed UK-EU Defence Pact in building up trust and deepening cooperation between the EU and the UK. And I asked this question also with, in mind, NATO summit that starts tomorrow, and that will be the first visit of Starmer in Washington, D.C. as the Prime Minister. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, so Labour has talked about having a foreign and security policy pact with the EU, and that's a bit of sort of leftover business, really, because the political declaration that went with the UK's withdrawal agreement from the EU said that there would be such an agreement on foreign and security policy cooperation, but Boris Johnson decided not to pursue it. And so I think Labour is picking that up. It's a loose end. It's something which I think the EU would welcome. What does it amount to? Mostly it means that, you would occasionally get British ministers and officials meeting their EU counterparts in a kind of structured way to talk about regional issues, thematic issues, the gamut of foreign policy and defence issues. I think the complicated part of it is if the UK wants to be involved in defence industrial cooperation with the EU, because there you start to run into countries' national industrial policy interests. And we've seen that the EU has written the rules for third parties taking part in EU defence industrial programs in a way that makes it really pretty difficult. So I think, there's definitely some hope there, definitely some scope for an agreement to be reached. And it would be good if there were these structured talks on a fairly regular basis. But I think there are also some obstacles when it comes to the industrial side of it. When it comes to NATO and so on, I think it's fantastic timing for Keir Starmer that he can be in Washington tomorrow and meet all of his NATO colleagues and a few others like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, all in one place at one time. I suspect there will be a lot of sort of speed dating going on in the corridors of the meeting venue in Washington, for Keir Starmer just to, shake hands with as many of these leaders as he possibly can. But I think, they, to be honest, will be quite relieved to see a prime minister who's got 5 years ahead of him, where he isn't constantly having to wonder who in his own party is going to stab him in the back.
Jan, thanks. A lot of speed dating for Starmer, but do you expect any surprises in terms of more commitment of Starmer to support the Euro-Atlantic security apparatus, so more on NATO? There have been talks about increasing the defense budget to 2.5% of the GDP. Do you expect any of that coming up in the next few weeks?
I mean, I would love to see that, but I'm not holding my breath. I mean, I think Rachel Reeves is looking at a set of accounts for the UK which will be covered in red ink. Now, I might say, and I will say, that I think that our national defence should be a higher priority. But I suspect that if I am in Rachel Reeves' seat, I am looking at the Defence Secretary and saying, well, we've said 2.5% when the economic circumstances allow. The economic circumstances do not yet allow, and I think we may have to wait a while before more money is allocated to defence. Hope I'm wrong, but I suspect I'm right.
Thank you, Jan. I have more questions. This is a fascinating conversation, but I have also a couple of questions from the audience that I would like to respect and take them. There's a question for Ed. What can we expect to change or stay the same on immigration with the new Labour government? Immigration has been a hot topic also for a long time in the UK. So, Ed, your take on that?
Thanks, Val. So we've already seen one of the first things that Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, said was that the Rwanda scheme, which had been this issue which the previous Conservative government have been pursuing for the last 2 or 3 years with very little success, has been scrapped. So there'll be no further work taking on the Rwanda scheme. But it's absolutely clear that there is going to be extraordinary pressure on the Labour government, and they recognise this pressure and recognise the responsibility, that they are going to have to demonstrate some action on immigration, partly to deal with the issue of small boats across the Channel, which is a very visible reflection, if you like, about wider concerns about control. Labour's also said that it will reduce the overall levels of migration to the net migration to UK, which is not much of a pledge because it's going to come down from pretty high, extraordinary high levels. So that will, I'm sure, will be achieved. But I think that Labour in government is going to be looking for some big ways of demonstrating action on tackling the issue, particularly of illegal immigration, and that sort of comes back to the issues about the relationship with the EU. I think part of the security pact, which Ian talked about, the UK will certainly be looking to try and incorporate illegal immigration to some of those issues into that work, and they will certainly looking for much better collaboration with the French on returns. So there will be a period when, if you like, any new government is given a period of grace, if you like, while it works out what it will seek to do. But it recognises the urgency of this issue, and Labour will need to demonstrate action. There's talk of cracking down the criminal gangs. It's very easy to say, as governments across Europe of experience, this is very difficult to do. And of course, the politics of that is interesting. There are a number of now Labour MPs who, as reflected before, whose main challenges in their constituencies are on the left, are independents on the left or Greens on the left, who are going to be putting pressure, if you like, for Labour government not to be too tough on immigration. So there will be an interesting political issue, but I think you've got now Yvette Cooper, who's the new Home Secretary. Keir Starmer himself are very clear that there needs to be demonstrable action on this, and that will have to come through a mixture of issues around security and enforcement in the UK, but also international collaboration, particularly with France.
Well, thank you, Ed. Very quickly to follow up with you in terms of more of a foreign policy. How do you explain what does the Foreign Secretary's David Lammy doctrine of progressive realism means in practice? Very briefly.
Yeah, it's an attempt to, if you like, reflect. It's an attempt to encapsulate the tension between continuity and change, as you've reflected in terms of Labour policy. So there will be large areas of Labour's foreign policy, which will be continuity, particularly on the security foreign policy side. Ukraine, you've mentioned, obviously, is a key issue currently, and Labour will be steadfast and robust in support for Ukraine. And the NATO summit this week will be an opportunity where Keir Starmer will reflect that internationally. But there are areas where the Labour Party will be looking to demonstrate a different approach in its international relations. I mean, partly that will be about the process. It will be partly much more, and we see that just over the weekend with David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary in Berlin, in Stockholm, and Warsaw. You're going to have a much more engaged UK government internationally, looking to build relationships in Europe and elsewhere. And on issues like international development, Labour will look to reinforce, if you like, Labour's commitment to international development and to build and through multilateral institutions and through its relationships with key allies, a much more robust position on international development. And that will also, by the way, include much better relationship with the global south. So David Lammy has talked about the need to improve relationships with European allies, with the global south, and on key issues like the climate and others. They'll certainly want to, and Yasmin talked about Gaza. They'll certainly want in certain areas to reflect either nuance or significant change alongside those areas of key continuity on security.
Well, thanks, Ed. So a UK more engaged internationally. So maybe we'll see more of a global UK, which that was a slogan that was used years ago, but kind of started, fading out. So more of a global UK. Jasmine, very briefly, with the fact that, we have budget constraints in the UK and many of the internal economic issues are taking priority, our viewers are concerned about the UK support for Ukraine. Do you think that will continue? Will it be realistic in the future?
Yes, yeah, I think that's, as Ed was just saying, I think that's an area where the UK is going to want to maintain its leading role internationally in terms of its high support for Ukraine. If we cast our minds back to the Johnson administration, I mean, whilst it's remembered primarily for things like Partygate and Brexit, I mean, one of the real highlights was Johnson's very strong support for Ukraine. It's something that his successors wanted to carry forward, and I think it's something certainly that Starmer is going to want to carry forward as well, especially as my fellow panelists were just saying, that the UK is seen as more of a stable actor these days. It's going to want to, I think, flex its role in NATO, in the G7 and things like that. So really asserting its leadership potential there.
Well, thank you. Charles, maybe any other point from you before we close?
Thank you. I think David Cameron, the previous Foreign Secretary, actually pledged $3 billion a year to Ukraine, at least. I see no reason why the Labour government wouldn't keep that pledge as part of its policy. So I agree with everyone that there isn't that much to worry about on the UK support of Ukraine. Certainly, there are many other countries where we can be a little bit more concerned. And generally, I mean, this panel's been interesting simply to assess everyone's level of optimism or pessimism. I think stability is a huge factor, which will play in the UK's favour in the months and even years to come. There are many problems, though, that the Labour government's inheriting. And I do share the frustration that some of my fellow panelists have expressed with their lack of ambition. But I think that was a campaign strategy that worked. So you have to give them that. And now that they have a stable majority, hopefully this will mean that they actually solve some of the problems. Ed called planning policy unsexy. I think it's now such a problem that many people in the UK are actually quite familiar with it. Obviously, there are a lot of vested interests and in local constituencies where people will push back against new houses being built. But I think if I were to express one wish for this government to achieve something in the next 5 years, it would be on that. And I'm cautiously optimistic. Let's see.
Well, thank you, Charles. And we like your level of optimism, and that's how we would like to close this session. Well, thank you very much to our excellent panelists, Jan Bond, Charles Lichtfeld, Ed Owen, and Jasmine Serhan. Thank you for being with us today and in an hour covering so many subjects that were very interesting for our audience. I still have many questions from the audience that we could not go through, but thank you very much. And until next time.